All right. Hi there, and welcome to week 13 of the semester. Hard to believe that we are, gosh, almost done with our term. Hard to believe, and then at the same time, so thankful, right? Um, so, this is generally how I'm feeling. If you all recognize this reference, it's from the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and this is the bratty little girl who kept saying, I want it now. So I found this and I thought, oh, how appropriate for how I feel sometimes at this point in the semester. Okay, so what we're up to this week and next week, we're going to kind of treat this week and next week as together weeks as we did last week. And so the reading for this week is part one of the Super Communicator book. So if you haven't read that, I would stop the video now and I would go and read that and then watch the video because there are some elements I want to pull out, but I think they're better for you to experience after you've read part one. So that would be my recommendation. You can do it either way, but my recommendation would be to do the reading first and then take a look and listen to this the rest of this video. As a reminder, your social media analysis assignment is due this Sunday, so I just wanted to remind you about that. And one thing I don't have on the slide, but I wanted to say thank you to all of you who came in and visited with me. Many of you I had not met before, so it was really a great opportunity to meet you face to face and kind of learn a little more about you and then talk about any of the questions or anything you had. So I really appreciate your time. I know that we all have very busy schedules, and taking an online class, oftentimes you're doing that because your schedule is really busy. But your time and coming in really helps me sort of put into context all kinds of things related to our class. So I really appreciate that and wanted to share that with you. The rest of the semester now, this week, next week, and the last 2 weeks, right? Because we're in week 13 and we go through week 16. Anyway, the rest of the term, we're really going to be focused on your final client project and doing the revisions to your current elements that you've created, using the feedback that you've gotten. And I've gotten through everything but the social media activity from last week. And so we're going to talk about the process of how you put all this stuff together, how it works, all those kinds of things. So that's where we're headed. But I want to talk first about the Super Communicator book. There is a reason I use this book, and I like it a lot, but I use it in kind of a different way. I know you've read different elements of it throughout the semester, but this week, you're reading part one, which seems a little bit funny. Because oftentimes it makes sense to us, right, to start at the beginning of a book, and yet I have kind of chopped it up. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about why it is that I left this section sort of till the end of the term, certainly in the last part of our term. So we've been reading this book kind of out of order. And the main reason for that is that I wanted to have you understand some of the fundamentals about strategic communication and the pieces that go into it. So things like a news release, things like a fact sheet. Wanted you to have that experience first and then kind of augment that and get you to adjust your thinking a little bit now that you know what the different components are to sort of level up the work, the strategic communication work that you now are familiar with, and how that needs to be adjusted or, like I said, augmented in today's highly digital environment. So the Super Communicator book is really designed for people who are practicing any kind of communication. And then it tries to get you to understand that in order to really be an effective communicator, you need to use the digital and the visual and the multimedia tools and concepts that are available so that you can meet your audience needs. So one of the things that we've talked about in this class is, identifying your audience. You know that that's important. You've taken steps to start doing that with your client project. And then we've also read in this book, in the Super Communicator book, about simplifying content, but not being overly simple in doing that. So the Super Communicator book again is really offers some insight into how to make your communication next level almost, and that's the best term I can come up with. I haven't really come across another relevant term. I mean, so supposedly you could say we're digitizing, but I really don't feel like that is a sufficiently descriptive term. So prior to now, we really focused on, good strategic communication principles, and we learned about public relations and some of the fundamentals. But the super communicator really helps us think about how, with some real specific examples, how to add in digital, visual, audio, and other multimedia things to our work to make it more relevant, attractive, and interesting, and attention-getting, quite frankly, for 21st century communication expectations. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to pull out some of the ideas that I believe are really the key in this part one of the book. So I want you to be thinking about these things. Okay, so in chapter one, Petruccia talks about delivering meaning. And he first starts talking about communicators, and his definition of a communicator is really broad here. Anyone with an idea or information to share. If you think about it, this definition is kind of different than the one that we've used as our sort of practice definition this semester. We've talked about communicating, a communicator being someone who communicates on behalf of an organization. But what Petruccia is saying here is that really anyone who has ideas or information to share is someone who is communicating or wants to communicate information. And what that means is there's a broader, bigger group of people communicating. And so learning how to meet needs, not just communicating on behalf of an organization, but say making an argument to your parents or another source like that who maybe would be in a position to help you financially contribute to a study abroad experience or something like that. So you're trying to communicate ideas and maybe even persuade someone. This happens a lot more than just communicating on behalf of an organization. So he really opens up and broadens his definition. So think a little bit about what's the difference between Petruccia's definition here and what we've been using as our sort of communicator position this semester. He talks a lot about how digital tools and the internet can certainly make things easier in terms of sharing information. He also talks about these tools helping us put information into forms that are more easily understood and that help us with a deeper understanding. What he means by that is, I think, that it helps us explain the complicated, right? Which is the subtitle of the book, explaining the complicated so anyone can understand. And so his point really is these tools that are now available to us pretty freely and inexpensively have sort of changed, but not at all changed, how communication, strategic communication specifically works. So his point here is, embracing the digital, even if you're like me and you're a little bit wary of new technologies and new tools. I tend to run into problems with new technology. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, I had trouble with this video software. And so I can be a little reluctant to embrace digital or new tools or things like that. But really what he points out is that these digital technologies and tools not only can help your ideas thrive, can not only help you communicate more effectively, but it really can make your ideas or help your ideas thrive. So that's one of the big takeaways from his from chapter one here. I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 2 and chapter 3 together, at least on the same slide here. In chapter 2 mentions first this idea of digital natives, and you probably have heard this term before, and you've probably also heard the term millennial. But that is your generation. You, if you are in college now and taking this class, you are at the tail end of what's considered the millennial generation. You are the first generation of human beings to have had computer technology, and not only that, but internet technology, all of your whole lifespan. So that makes you a distinctly different generation in certain different ways. You have certain characteristics that you've shared, despite how different you may be from the person sitting next to you. You share a lot of similarities in terms of experiencing digital technology and that just being a fundamental part of your life. Whereas people in my generation, which is called Generation X, we were alive for a few years, and depending on what part of the generation you're in, we were alive for a few to several years before computer technology and the personal computer was available in our homes and in our schools. So, and certainly before the internet was common and prolific as it is now. So, understand that, again, part of this book is really talking to practitioners who may not be in the digital generation. He seems to be a little bit talking more to people in my generation or people who are a little older who didn't have this digital native idea. And yet, I still think this is a helpful book, because he does talk about how the internet is rewiring our brains. And even in your lifetime, I think you can see a difference between expectations. If you think about maybe when you started turning in assignments in school, they used to be on paper, and now more and more, you're turning in assignments online. You're taking an online class in college. So before we used to just read a document, and now we really end up having to interact with messages on a screen. And previously, in reading a printed document, our role as an individual was kind of passive, right? We just had to look at something. We didn't really have to take any action. Somebody handed us a piece of paper. Whereas now we need to interact with messages. We need to interact with things on a screen, and we need to click and download and all those kinds of things. So while it may not seem like a big difference, the way that our brains work makes it, has to work to do these things, makes it different. Another thing he talks about is this sense of instant gratification, is that with the speed of the digital environment, we all have a sense of instant gratification. Think about how fast you can get in touch with someone, how fast you can get a response from a friend of yours. And so how fast can you find out where, the nearest gas station is, or how can you can find things so fast. Many of us have smartphones. All of us have broadband internet connections. And so it's easy for us to find things quickly. And so we have this sense of instant gratification. If I have a question, I can get an answer really quick. But thinking about what's the downside of this, I think is pretty important. One of the things I think that's still a downside about this is that we have an expectation that things are going to happen very quickly. And that changes when we are the message creators. He also talks about, losing my place here a little bit, sorry. He says that constantly connected people are more likely to jump to make quick, shallow choices in our quest for consistent, instant gratification. And so, again, we need to slow down when we are creating or crafting a message of any kind. We can't work as fast as we receive messages or we experience messages. So that's something important to think about. In chapter 3, he talks about multimedia, and he gives the example, and if you didn't look at this snowfall story from the New York Times, we're going to look at it here for just a minute. This is an amazing multimedia story, and this, if you'll pardon the expression, was kind of a line in the sand, demarcating pre-multimedia storytelling, and now in the era where this is quite often expected, especially with a significant story. And I'll show you what I mean by that. But as you look at this, think about the digital tools or the digital elements that really make this story more real, and why that might be. So we'll take a look here at the website. Excuse me, and this is like I said, this is a feature article from the New York Times. I believe it's from about 2011. And what is the first thing that you notice about this? Well, to me, yes, there's a big picture, and so I noticed that, but it took me a minute when I first looked at this to recognize that the snow is blowing on this image. And so right away you can see that this is sort of a little bit different than a typical news story. And then you start scrolling down, and there's the text of the article. Again, remember, this is a major feature article. This is a lot of time and resources poured into this, but it's a great example. There's a video here of somebody who was involved in this particular avalanche at Tunnel Creek. So there's a video here. I guess I'd be thinking about the technology, the multimedia that is used to help tell this story. Okay, so again, back in 2011, we didn't have easily accessible drones where we could have done actual footage of this. So what they did was they recreated a computer simulation or computer map so that you can see the area of the pass, of the ski area that they're talking about in this particular story and where the avalanche ended up happening. So the avalanche was over here on Tunnel Creek on this side of the mountain. So as we go down further, you can see some historic photos, so that's pretty typical. Another video that talks about kind of the skiing atmosphere at Tunnel Creek. Talks about backcountry skiing, which is a big part of this story. The advertisement here has been cut out because it's an older piece, and so they've cut out the advertising here. There's a slideshow involved with somebody also again in the story. Another slideshow, so a series of slideshows here about these people and their involvement. Another show that was, again, representing the story here. This is another one of my favorites, this animation of the storm itself. And so again, the idea here is that it gives you a visual. It shows you where Stevens Pass, where this happened. It shows you the trajectory of this storm and how much snow it produced. You can go on to the next part and see the whole story. I'm going to stop here for sake of time, but I wanted you to see this because it is, he talks about it in a book that is a textbook, right? But I wanted you to see it as we're talking about the book itself, and think about how the digital tools that were employed made this story real for readers. I would recommend that you go back and read the story because it is pretty remarkable. He also talks a little bit about this idea of stickiness. What makes something sticky? And he talks about it in the context of getting people to stay on a website to read a particular message or something like that. But I want you to think a little bit about what does message stickiness mean? And if you don't know, you might check into that. But what makes something sticky is this idea that it sticks with you. I know that's kind of a duh, but sometimes it's a little bit hard to remember that that's what this means rather than the literal, there's some tape or residue or something like that. So it's the idea that a message or an impression or an idea or a visual sticks with you. And really that's one of the things that digital story, Snowfall, was trying to do, was trying to get the message of the story to be pretty sticky. He also then talks about data visualization and how increasingly that and big data are digital tools that help people tell stories and make things much more, again, real for people. So in chapter 4, he talks about how digital changes how we experience information. This is a fairly short chapter, but one of the things I really like about it is this chart that he has. He talks about what are the characteristics of print traditional communication versus digital communication. And he said that essentially we experience information in much more bite-sized pieces. I think a little contrary example is the Snowfall story, because the text in that story is pretty long, but what he's talking about is you can read pieces of the text and then you can go and pursue the slideshows or the videos. So the way that you can experience that whole story, you don't just read from beginning to end. You can, as he talks about it, have multiple entry points here rather than just starting at the beginning. It's non-linear in the sense that you can hop around. You can look at all the video and the visuals first, and then go back and read. You can kind of do it in any way that makes sense to you. So he talks about this, and that when we're creating a story or a message using words and or visuals, we are not able to operate and create as fast as we experience things, whereas we consume things. So in being a communicator, in being a message creator, it's very important that you recognize all of a sudden you're not the consumer of the message anymore. You got to kind of slow down. It's a change in speed. And so he talks about that in this chapter. I think that's really important. So in chapter 5, he talks about finding the right way to deliver your content. And I would say that this is not unique to this digital internet environment. This has always been important. But I think what he's meaning is that it's more important than ever before because you have so many different tools. And certain types of people and certain audiences use certain tools and not others. And so asking yourself, and doing the research, we've talked about audience analysis in this class, finding out what's the right medium and how you know that for sure is really important. And choosing what is most important to communicate. So he uses the example of the NASA Columbia explosion accident investigation board, and he talked about after the investigation had been done, there was a presentation and that they used a PowerPoint presentation. And as we all know, it's very annoying when someone misuses a PowerPoint presentation. If you write sentences and then you read those sentences as a presenter, that's very boring, right, for you for someone as a listener or a viewer. But what we don't often think about is what's left out when we use a particular type of communication media. The example talked about that it was very, very frustrating for the accident investigation board because the people who presented left information out. And so that was pretty significant in that particular instance, that they use, bulleted style communication on a PowerPoint. And it just wasn't the right medium to deliver the information that formal documents or longer papers that explain things explicitly in that instance would have been better. And so, encouraging you to think about what are your audience's needs? What are they going to like? What are they going to find attractive? What's going to be useful for that group of people? And then one of the last things he makes a point about in this chapter is that he says, you don't have to do it all. We're talking about all kinds of different things here. And I think what gets frustrating sometimes is we feel like, oh my gosh, I have to learn all of this different type of stuff. And that's not really true. You're going to end up in whatever job you're in, you're going to end up in whether it's a formal or an informal collaboration or team situation. And so you are not necessarily going to be expected to have all of these tools and be fantastic at all of these things. So important for you to think about that when you make these choices about communicating in a work environment, it most of the time it's not going to be just you. So those are the main ideas that were in the part 1 chapters that I thought would be good to call out, and just kind of highlight for you. I want to talk briefly about the client project now. This is really the culmination of the majority of the work that you've done. We're going to focus this time and then again next week and into our 15th week on the revision process. And so when you go to access the final project assignment sheet, what you'll see is that there are 4 pieces that you have created: the organizational profile, the fact sheet, the news release, and the social media analysis that you're turning in this week. Those 4 pieces are what you're going to revise and update for your final project submission. You're also going to add an introduction and a summary, and there are specific directions about what goes into that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in next week's video. But you're going to add sort of a beginning and an end to these 4 elements. and we'll talk about how to put that together. You'll submit as a single PDF document on Canvas, and I'm also offering an extra credit opportunity. I will give you more directions about this next week, to upload your work to an e-portfolio system that's called Portfolium. It's free to you as a user, as a student. It will always be free to you, and one of the nice things about it is oftentimes when you have access to free things, you see lots of advertisements. My understanding is that you will not have advertisements shared with you on this site. That's one of the upshots of using it. And so we'll talk about that next week, but I'm going to encourage you to use this to upload your work, and I'll talk more next week about why you might be interested in having an e-portfolio, even if you're not a communication student. So if you're not an Ag and Environmental Sciences communication major or minor, you might still be interested in having your work available on Portfolium to share with the people that you choose to share with. So I wanted to give you a heads up about what the final client project is going to be like. We'll talk more about it next week. Certainly if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me. I know we've talked about this with a couple of you during our individual meetings, but wanted to give you a sense of what's coming at you in the next couple of weeks. So there is a reading that's posted on, it will be posted in our module section, and it's also posted on the course outline that's available in Google Docs. And it's about revising your paper. If you want to get a jump on things, you may go ahead and look at that. You can also sort of envision that paper in this instance is any one of the different components of your client project. It's really written for revising like a term paper or something like that, but there's a lot of really useful information in it. So that's why it's kind of termed that way, revising your paper. So we'll talk about putting the project together, and then we'll talk about revising your work. And next week, for your weekly activity, we won't have one for this week, but we will talk about how we'll handle the peer feedback workshop, and I'll give you directions about that. So there you have it. I will have one other, nope, this is it. This is the only video for this week, and we will talk revision process next week. Okay, sorry for the length. Good to see you all. Have a great week.